The sun had barely risen when the first timid lights of the morning began to illuminate the vast and silent cemetery. The tall, ancient trees with their gnarled branches created a somber and melancholic scene. The leaves fell slowly, as if each one was in mourning. Around the luxurious mahogany coffin, adorned with white and red flowers, the sad and desolate faces of those present reflected the immeasurable loss they felt. Inside the coffin, however, something extraordinary was happening. With tremendous effort, his eyes slowly opened. At first, he couldn't understand where he was or why his movements were so restricted. But the darkness and silence gave him a disturbing clue. He was inside a coffin at his own funeral. Richard Montgomery, the business magnate known for his sagacity and unwavering determination, never imagined his fate would be so cruelly sealed by treacherous hands. Panic tried to take hold of him, but he knew he needed calm and reason. He listened to the distant murmurs, recognizing the familiar voices of friends, family, and colleagues who had come to pay their respects. Then he heard something that made his blood run cold. His wife Sophie was speaking in a low, intimate tone with someone he couldn't identify. He strained to listen better, and the words that reached his ears were like sharp knives piercing his heart. "He's finally out of our way. Now we can have everything without anyone to interfere with our plans," said Sophie, with a coldness Richard had never suspected. "We have to be careful, Sophie," replied a male voice Richard recognized as his partner Michael. "Any mistake could expose us." Richard couldn't believe what he was hearing. The accident he thought was a tragic coincidence was actually a meticulously planned murder attempt by those he trusted most. A wave of anger mixed with fierce determination took over his being. He couldn't let Sophie and Michael get away with it. With the strength that remained in his weakened body, he managed to push the coffin lid. The lid gave way with a loud creak, which silenced everyone around. The attendees were stunned when they saw Richard, alive, emerging from the coffin, with a look of vengeance burning in his eyes. The screams and murmurs increased, but Richard didn't take his eyes off Sophie and Michael, who were paralyzed with shock. This would be just the beginning of an unrelenting journey to expose the betrayal and obtain the revenge he so desired. From that moment on, Richard Montgomery was determined to destroy those who had tried to destroy him, leaving no stone unturned. The sight of Richard Montgomery emerging alive from the coffin had left everyone at the funeral in a state of absolute shock. Murmurs and screams of surprise filled the air, but Richard didn't care about the reactions around him. His eyes were fixed on Sophie and Michael, who were now livid, not knowing how to react. With a determined move, Richard stepped out of the coffin, feeling pain pulsating in every part of his body, but the adrenaline kept him standing. A few true friends of Richard ran to him, concerned and incredulous. "Richard, how is this possible?" asked one of them, eyes wide. Richard just shook his head, still absorbing the magnitude of what he had just heard. Without saying a word, he walked away from the attendees, his legs trembling as he moved, but his determination growing with each step. He knew he needed to get out of there, find a safe place to plan his next move. In a quiet side street, he finally managed to take a deep breath. Leaning against a tree, he began to process what he had heard. His wife Sophie, with whom he had shared years of life, was not the woman he thought he knew. The sweet smile, the caresses, and the moments that seemed genuine now appeared as a cruel facade. And Michael, his longtime partner, a man he trusted with his business and secrets, now revealed as a co-conspirator in this heinous betrayal. The pain of the betrayal was deep, but Richard knew he couldn't let these emotions paralyze him. He needed to be smarter, more strategic if he wanted to survive and achieve justice. He needed help, someone he could trust. It was then that he remembered Jack, an old friend from college, a skilled and resourceful man who could help create a new identity. Jack had always been a bit on the edge of the law, but loyal to Richard in a way few were. With the phone trembling in his hands, Richard called Jack. The voice on the other end was warm and firm. "Richard, is that really you?" Jack asked, the surprise evident in his voice. "Yes, Jack. I need your help. Something terrible has happened," Richard replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Jack didn't hesitate. Tell me where you are. I'll be there soon." While he waited, Richard knew this was just the beginning. He was ready to transform, to rise from the ashes of what his life had been. Sophie and Michael thought they were free to enjoy his fortune, but they had no idea what was coming. Richard Montgomery, the man they tried to bury, was more alive and determined than ever. In the secure darkness of Jack's hideout, Richard finally had a moment to reflect. The rustic cabin, hidden deep in a dense forest, was the perfect place to hide and plan. The wooden walls, covered with maps and documents, gave the place a sense of readiness and strategy. Jack, always slightly disheveled but with keen and bright eyes, was already working on a plan. "Richard, we need to understand exactly what happened," Jack said with a grave voice. He placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of Richard as they sat at the table. Richard nodded, taking a deep breath before starting. "It was a car accident. At least I thought it was. I woke up in the hospital with some vague memories, but when I heard Sophie and Michael at the funeral, it became clear. They planned everything." Jack frowned, absorbing the gravity of the situation. "Do you know how they did it?" "I don't have all the details," Richard admitted, eyes fixed on the coffee cup. "But I know Michael has contacts in the underworld. He probably hired someone to tamper with my car." Jack got up and started pacing the room, his steps echoing softly on the wooden floor. "We need proof, Richard. Without it, you can't just accuse them. They are dangerous, and if they tried to kill you once, they'll try again." Richard knew Jack was right. It was a complex chess game where every move needed to be precisely calculated. "We have to start with the basics," Richard said, his voice gaining strength. "We need information about Sophie and Michael's movements, financial transactions, contacts, anything that can lead us to their accomplices." Jack smiled, a determined gleam in his eyes. "I have some connections that can help. Let's start with that." While Jack made calls and organized the first steps of the investigation, Richard let his mind wander to the moments leading up to the accident. He remembered a recent meeting with Michael, where his partner seemed more nervous than usual, and Sophie, who had been more distant lately, but he never suspected something so sinister was unfolding. Jack returned with a laptop and some printed sheets. "Here are the first reports. Sophie has been transferring large sums of money to an offshore account. And Michael? Well, he has been in contact with some very shady figures." Richard studied the documents carefully, feeling the anger grow inside him. This is just the beginning. They think they've won, but they're very wrong. Jack's cabin had become a sanctuary of safety and strategy, but Richard knew he couldn't hide forever. The forest shadows offered shelter, but there was a growing restlessness in his heart. He needed to return to the city, to the world that betrayed him, to gather more information and begin dismantling Sophie and Michael's plans. One night, as the full moon illuminated the forest, Richard and Jack prepared for their first incursion. "We'll enter the city quietly," Jack said, adjusting his cap and checking the equipment. "We need to be quick and discreet." Richard, now dressed in simple clothes and a cap that hid his face, nodded. "I'll gather more information on Sophie's movements. I want to know who she's meeting with." The two men got into Jack's car, a discreet sedan that wouldn't attract attention. The drive to the city was silent, except for the sound of the tires on the road and the distant hum of the forest. Richard looked out the window, seeing the city lights approaching, feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. They arrived at a small cafe where Jack had a contact who could provide valuable information. The place was modest, with worn wooden tables and an old jukebox playing softly in the corner. Jack waved to a man sitting at the back, who stood up and approached them. "This is Sam," Jack said, introducing the man to Richard. "He has eyes and ears everywhere." Sam was a middle-aged man, with a face marked by a hard life and piercing eyes. "Jack told me you need information on some suspicious movements," Sam said, sitting next to them. Richard nodded. "My wife, Sophie, and my partner, Michael. I need to know who they're meeting with and what they're planning." Sam pulled out a notepad and began writing. "Sophie has been seen in some interesting places. Hotels, discreet meetings. It seems she's trying to keep things under the radar. Michael, on the other hand, has been bolder. He's been seen in some exclusive clubs, places where shady deals are made. Can you take us there? Richard asked, his voice firm. Sam looked at Richard for a moment, assessing him. I can, but you should know those places are dangerous. If they recognize you. Don't worry, Richard interrupted. I'll be prepared. With the first pieces of information in hand, the trio left the cafe and headed to the first place where Sophie had been seen. It was an elegant hotel, hidden on a quiet street. Richard watched from a distance, feeling a mix of anger and pain. Sophie was inside, possibly planning her next move against him. Let's go in, Richard said, his voice filled with determination. Jack and Sam exchanged a worried look but followed Richard into the hotel lobby. Moving carefully, they infiltrated the shadows. Richard knew that night would be just the first of many incursions. He was ready to face danger, to hide in the shadows and discover the truth. From a strategic position, they watched as Sophie emerged from an elevator, laughing alongside a man who wasn't Michael. Every moment, every detail would be crucial for his revenge. Fleeing from the shadows was just the beginning of a relentless battle. Richard was determined to expose every betrayal, every lie, until there was nothing left but the raw truth. As the clock struck midnight, Richard, Jack, and Sam returned to the cabin in the forest, the night's events still fresh in their minds. Seeing Sophie laughing with another man at the hotel had solidified Richard's anger and determination. But to bring down Sophie and Michael, he needed more than just his team and his new identity. He needed a strong and reliable alliance. Jack, always perceptive, noticed Richard's concern. You're thinking of someone specific to help us, aren't you? Richard nodded. Yes, I am. There's someone who can make a difference. Someone I've always trusted. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. After a few rings, a familiar, deep voice answered. Richard? It's been so long. Sam, Richard said, a slight emotion in his voice. I need your help. Sam Turner was an Army veteran, a man who had fought alongside Richard in times of war, and who now operated in the world of surveillance and private security. He was the kind of ally Richard needed, loyal, skilled, and with valuable resources. The next morning, Sam arrived at the cabin, his imposing presence filling the rustic space. He shook Richard's hand firmly, his eyes reflecting a silent understanding. It seems you're in a complicated situation, old friend. Richard gave a half-smile. You have no idea. Sophie and Michael tried to kill me. I need to bring them down, and I need your help to do it. Sam nodded, his face serious. Tell me what you need. With Jack and Sam by his side, Richard felt a new wave of hope. They began to outline a detailed plan, dividing tasks and creating a network of espionage that would allow them to monitor every move Sophie and Michael made. Jack would handle financial infiltration, while Sam used his surveillance skills to follow the targets and gather crucial evidence. One night, while the group discussed strategies around a table full of maps and files, Sam brought important news. I found where Michael keeps his most important documents. He has a safe in a commercial building downtown. We need someone to go in and get those documents. Richard knew this was a golden opportunity. I'll do it myself, he said, his voice firm. It's time to go on the offensive. The operation was meticulously planned. Jack managed to forge documents that would give Richard access to the building, while Sam ensured the security system would be temporarily disabled. When the night of the incursion arrived, Richard was ready. Dressed in dark clothes and with security equipment provided by Sam, Richard entered the building. His heart was pounding, but his determination to seek justice guided him. He moved with agility, reaching Michael's office undetected. The safe was hidden behind a painting, exactly where Sam had said it would be. With skill and precision, Richard opened the safe and found a series of incriminating documents, financial transactions, suspicious contracts, and even evidence linking Michael to criminal activities. With the documents in hand, Richard left the building as quietly as he had entered. Back at the cabin, he handed the papers to Jack and Sam. This is just the beginning, Richard said. his voice filled with renewed confidence. "We'll use this to dismantle everything they've built on lies and betrayals." As night turned into morning, the trio knew they were closer to justice. With loyal allies and a plan in action, Richard was determined to destroy Sophie and Michael, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the ruins of their betrayals. Dawn brought with it a new sense of purpose. In the cabin, the atmosphere was charged with tension and anticipation. Richard, Jack, and Sam analyzed the documents obtained from Michael's safe, outlining the next steps. But for Richard, assuming a new identity was crucial to moving freely and acting without raising suspicion. "We need to transform you into someone else," Jack said, adjusting his glasses and examining some papers on the table. "Something Sophie and Michael would never suspect." Richard nodded, aware of the need for a radical change. "A new name, a new story. Everything needs to be perfect." Sam, with his vast experience in creating false identities for clandestine operations, began outlining the profile. "We'll turn you into a foreign businessman. Someone with legitimate but obscure enough businesses to justify curiosity." Hours later, with forged documents, a new passport, and a detailed background, Richard Montgomery ceased to exist. In his place was born Alexander Collins, a British investor with interests in emerging technology and financial markets. Jack looked at Richard, or rather Alexander, with an approving expression. "You're ready. Remember, every detail matters. Speak with confidence, keep the story coherent." Richard, now Alexander, rehearsed his new identity several times, until every word and every gesture were natural. He needed to be convincing, not only to deceive Sophie and Michael but also to gain the trust of those around them. Alexander's first mission would be to attend a gala event at one of the city's most luxurious hotels, where Sophie and Michael would be present. This event would be the perfect opportunity to infiltrate their social circle without raising suspicion. Dressed in an impeccable suit, with a polished British accent, Alexander entered the ballroom. The environment was opulent, with sparkling chandeliers and soft music in the background. The guests, a mix of business elites and socialites, circulated the room, engaged in superficial conversations and discreet deals. Sophie was stunning in a red dress, her laughter echoing through the room as she conversed with influential businessmen. Michael, always by her side, kept a vigilant eye, as if sensing something was amiss. Alexander picked up a glass of champagne and approached the group where Sophie was. "Good evening, Miss Alexander Collins," he said, extending his hand with a charming smile. Sophie looked at him, surprised by the unexpected approach, but quickly composed herself with a smile. "Good evening, Mr. Collins. I'm Sophie. It's a pleasure to meet you, Sophie. I've heard a lot about your business initiatives," Alexander said, with a calculated tone of admiration. "I hope we can discuss potential collaborations in the future." The conversation flowed smoothly, Sophie clearly captivated by Alexander's charm. Michael watched with a neutral expression, but Alexander felt the scrutiny. Every word and movement were carefully executed, laying the groundwork for future interactions. As the night progressed, Alexander managed to get close to other members of Sophie and Michael's inner circle, each encounter increasing his credibility and insertion into their lives. When the night finally came to an end, Alexander left the event with a sense of accomplishment. He knew he was one step closer to exposing and destroying those who had betrayed him. The new identity was not just a disguise, but a powerful weapon in his quest for justice and revenge. On the way back to the cabin, Richard reflected on the night. The first move in the great chess game was made, and he was determined to win. With Jack and Sam by his side, and now as Alexander Collins, he was ready to face any challenge Sophie and Michael threw his way. The days following the gala event were a whirlwind of activity. In the cabin, Richard's team, now Alexander, worked tirelessly to analyze every detail of the interactions and plan the next steps. Alexander's insertion into Sophie and Michael's social circle had been a success, but now it was time to start dismantling their lives, step by step. The first action was to undermine the trust between Sophie and Michael. Richard knew that one of the pillars of their partnership was mutual trust, built on secrets and conspiracies. If he could plant doubts, distrust, and jealousy, he would be closer to his revenge. One afternoon, while analyzing the information gathered at the event, Jack found something promising. Sophie has a private meeting with a lawyer next week. It seems she's making adjustments to her will. Richard smiled, a plan forming in his mind. We need to find out exactly what she's changing and use that to our advantage. With Sam's help, who had access to state-of-the-art surveillance equipment, they managed to place a bug in the lawyer's office. On the day of the meeting, they listened to every word exchanged. Sophie was increasing her share of the assets, clearly preparing for a future without Richard and possibly without Michael. Perfect, Richard murmured. We can use this to create a rift between them. The next step involved a series of calculated moves. Alexander began to get closer to Michael, insinuating that Sophie might not be as loyal as she appeared. During a business meeting, he casually let slip, "I heard your wife has been very busy lately. It must be hard to trust completely, especially when there's so much at stake." Michael frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the insinuation. "What do you mean by that, Alexander?" Alexander shrugged, maintaining a friendly tone. "Nothing in particular. Just that in my experience, business and personal relationships can become complicated. It's always good to keep an eye open." The seed of distrust was planted. In the days that followed, Alexander continued to foster doubts in Michael's mind, while simultaneously strengthening his presence in Sophie's life. He accompanied her to social events, offering business advice, always attentive to her reactions and confidences. One particularly luxurious night, during a party at a mansion, Sophie confided in Alexander that she was worried about Michael's recent behavior. "He's been so distant," she said, with a touch of vulnerability. "Sometimes I wonder if he's hiding something from me." Alexander seized the opportunity, offering a sympathetic look. "These situations are always complicated. Maybe he's dealing with something personal. You should be cautious and protect your interests." The conversation served to deepen Sophie's doubts and insecurities, while Alexander maintained a position of trust. Richard watched, analyzed, and adjusted his moves like a chess master, always one step ahead. Meanwhile, Jack and Sam were busy investigating Michael's business. They discovered suspicious financial transactions, money disappearing into offshore accounts, and investments in questionable ventures. This information would be crucial for the next strike. Alexander decided to confront Michael directly about his financial activities. During a seemingly casual meeting at an exclusive club, he mentioned, "Michael, I'm curious about some of your investments. They seem risky." Michael tried to hide his discomfort, but Alexander pressed gently, maintaining a tone of genuine concern. "I'm just saying this as a friend. If something goes wrong, it could be disastrous for all of us." Michael left the meeting visibly shaken. The trust between him and Sophie was eroding, and Alexander continued to reinforce those cracks. Every interaction, every word, every gesture was calculated to maximize the impact and accelerate their downfall. The first phase of the revenge plan was in motion, and Richard could see the first signs of success. Sophie and Michael were starting to distrust each other, their bonds of trust weakening day by day. With a dedicated team and a new identity, Richard was more determined than ever to destroy those who had betrayed his trust and tried to take his life. Night fell over the cabin in the forest, but in Richard's heart, the flame of vengeance burned intensely. The journey was just beginning, and he was prepared to face any obstacle in his path. As Richard delved deeper into Sophie and Michael's lives, he knew he needed to uncover secrets from the past that could be used against them. The trust between the two was already beginning to fray, but something more impactful was needed, something that could truly shake the foundations of their alliance. Sam, always effective, brought vital information. "I found something interesting in old files. It seems Sophie has a much more complicated past than she lets on." Richard approached to see the documents Sam had collected. "What did you find?" Sam handed over a folder full of newspaper clippings and old reports. "She was involved in a financial scandal about 10 years ago, before she met you. This was swept under the rug, but there are enough records to cause serious problems if it comes to light now. Richard analyzed the documents, his face hardening as he read each detail. And Michael? Is there anything we can use against him? Jack, who was checking some information on his laptop, looked up. Michael has ties to a money laundering network. He's been using the company's businesses as a front for these operations. This would not only compromise his position, but also bring serious legal consequences. With this new information, Richard began to plan how to reveal it in a way that would cause maximum impact. He knew he needed to be careful, releasing these bombs in a way that completely destabilized Sophie and Michael without them immediately knowing where the attack was coming from. The first stage of the plan was to gradually release the information about Sophie. During an elegant gala dinner, where major investors and business partners were present, Alexander found the perfect opportunity. He approached a group of journalists present, engaging them in animated conversation. "Did you know our dear Sophie has a rather intriguing history?" Alexander said, feigning a conspiratorial tone. "They say that years ago, she was involved in a financial scandal that almost ruined her career. Of course, that was before she met Richard Montgomery." The journalists, always hungry for a good scandal, began asking questions. Alexander smiled inwardly, knowing he had planted a seed that would quickly grow. He left the conversation with an air of mystery, allowing the journalists' curiosity to do the rest. In the following days, articles began to appear in various media outlets, reviving the old scandal and casting Sophie in a negative light. She desperately tried to control the damage, but the distrust between her and Michael only increased. Meanwhile, Richard and his team were ready for the next phase. Michael, using the information about the money laundering network, Sam prepared a detailed and anonymous dossier, which was sent to financial and law enforcement authorities. At the same time, Alexander began to drop subtle comments about Michael's activities during business meetings, planting doubts in the minds of his partners and investors. One morning, Michael woke up to a loud knock on the door. Police and federal agents were there with search and seizure warrants. "Michael Thompson, you are under investigation for money laundering and financial fraud," said the lead agent as the others began to search the house and office. Sophie, already overwhelmed with the media investigating her past, now faced a new crisis. She confronted Michael, her anger and frustration exploding. "You told me everything was under control, and now we're in the middle of a legal and financial nightmare." Michael tried to defend himself, but the trust between them was completely destroyed. "I didn't know this would happen. Someone is sabotaging us, Sophie, and we need to find out who." But as they grappled with mutual accusations and desperate attempts to control the situation, Richard, like Alexander, watched from afar, increasingly satisfied with the progress of his plan. He knew the disintegration of Sophie and Michael was inevitable, and with each revealed secret, he was closer to his complete revenge. Night settled again over the cabin in the forest, but inside, there was a sense of triumph. Richard knew the worst was yet to come for Sophie and Michael, and he was prepared to watch everything fall apart. With each calculated move, he continued to manipulate events, determined to destroy those who had betrayed his trust and tried to end his life. The city was abuzz with the recent scandals involving Sophie and Michael. Each new revelation was a devastating blow, undermining the trust of investors and allies. Meanwhile, Richard, still operating under the identity of Alexander Collins, was ready to take his games of manipulation to the next level. Alexander began attending more social and business events, always finding subtle ways to influence the perceptions of those around him. He knew the best way to destroy Sophie and Michael was to isolate them, driving away those they trusted and creating an environment of paranoia and distrust. One night, Alexander was invited to a luxurious charity event. The ballroom was filled with influential figures, politicians, businessmen, celebrities. Sophie was there, trying to maintain appearances, although the stress was clearly etched on her face. Michael, on the other hand, was absent, likely dealing with legal troubles. Alexander approached a group of investors who were discussing the recent events. He waited for an opportune moment before joining the conversation, a cordial smile on his face. "Good evening, gentlemen. It seems everyone is discussing the same disturbing events." One of the investors, a middle-aged man with a worried look, nodded. "Yes, it's unbelievable what's happening with Sophie and Michael. I never suspected something like this could occur." Alexander seized the opportunity. "It's true. But, I've always thought there was something strange about how they conducted their business. Perhaps it's time to reconsider our associations." The worried looks of the investors intensified. "Do you think there are more things we don't know about?" another asked, his voice filled with concern. Alexander shrugged, maintaining a calculated tone of neutrality. "I can't say for certain, but where there's smoke, there's usually fire. In times like this, we need to be prudent." The seed of doubt was planted. Alexander continued to circulate the room, spreading subtle comments, each designed to erode the trust in Sophie and Michael's relationships. He knew these small manipulations would add up, creating a web of distrust that would be almost impossible to untangle. Later that night, Alexander found Sophie isolated in a corner, drinking a glass of wine. He approached, offering a sympathetic smile. "Sophie, how are you? It seems things have been difficult lately." She sighed, the mask of confidence beginning to crumble. "Alexander, it's been hell. It feels like everything is falling apart around me, and I don't know who I can trust." Alexander nodded, feigning empathy. "These times are really tough, but know that if you need anything, I'm here to help." Sophie looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and despair. "Thank you, Alexander. Your friendship means a lot to me." He held her hand for a moment, a calculated gesture to reinforce her trust in him. "We're in this together. Remember that." In the following days, Alexander continued to undermine the stability of Sophie and Michael. He encouraged rumors, directed doubts, and made sure every move they made was observed and interpreted in the worst possible way. At the same time, he maintained his presence as a friend and ally to Sophie, increasing his influence over her. Meanwhile, Sam and Jack continued to monitor Michael, ensuring every step he took was watched and documented. Any attempt to circumvent the legal troubles or find support was quickly thwarted by strategically leaked information. A crucial meeting took place at an exclusive club, where Alexander found Michael in a meeting with a group of lawyers. Feigning coincidence, he approached after the meeting, offering a drink. "Michael, it seems you're facing tough times. Can I offer some help?" Michael, visibly exhausted and distrustful, accepted the drink but kept a cautious look. "I don't know who I can trust anymore, Alexander. It seems everyone is against me." Alexander smiled, maintaining a tone of understanding. "These times reveal people's true character. But remember, true friends stand by your side." With each interaction, Alexander was achieving exactly what he wanted. Sophie and Michael were becoming increasingly isolated, unable to trust anyone, not even each other. The cracks in their alliance were widening, and Richard knew he was on the right path to complete revenge. Night fell again, and while the city slept, Richard, as Alexander, continued to weave his web of manipulation. Every move was calculated, every word measured. He was determined to ensure Sophie and Michael paid for their betrayal, and each day, he was closer to seeing them completely collapse. The days turned into weeks, and as the siege around Sophie and Michael tightened, Richard realized he needed more than just his team and his new identity to ensure total success. He needed unexpected allies, people who had been affected by Sophie and Michael's actions, and who would now be willing to join his cause. One morning, while reviewing progress at their hideout, Jack brought intriguing news. "Richard, I found someone who could be useful. There's a former employee of Michael, Sarah Thompson, who was unjustly fired a few years ago. She has valuable information about his illicit operations." Richard frowned, interested. "Do you think she would be willing to help us?" Jack smiled. "I'm sure she would. She holds a deep grudge against Michael, and is willing to do whatever it takes to see him pay for his crimes." Richard knew he needed to approach Sarah carefully. He decided to meet her at a discreet cafe in the city. Dressed as Alexander Collins, he entered the cafe and saw her sitting at a corner table, her eyes scanning the place attentively. "Sarah Thompson?" he asked, approaching with a cordial smile. She looked up suspicious. Who are you? My name is Alexander Collins. I'm a friend of Richard Montgomery, he replied, sitting at the table. I heard you have some information about Michael that can help us bring him down. Sarah narrowed her eyes, studying him for a moment before speaking. Richard Montgomery? I thought he was dead. Alexander smiled, a touch of mystery in his expression. Let's just say he's much more alive than Michael would like, and he's determined to seek justice. But for that, we need your help. Sarah was silent for a moment, considering her options. Finally, she nodded. Michael fired me because I knew too much about his dirty dealings. He was involved in money laundering, tax fraud, and had connections with organized crime. I have documents that prove all of this. Alexander felt a wave of relief. These documents will be crucial for what we're planning. Are you willing to testify against him? She nodded again, her determination clear. Yes, I am. Michael destroyed my life, and now it's time for him to pay for it. With Sarah on board, Richard knew he had a new and powerful ally. But he also needed someone who could help undermine Sophie from within. Jack then suggested another person. There's an old friend of Sophie's, Mark Hastings. They had a falling out a few years ago and drifted apart. He knows a lot about her past and could be a key piece in dismantling her network. Richard decided to approach Mark in a similar manner. He found him at an upscale bar, where Mark was sitting alone drinking whiskey. Alexander approached, asking for permission to sit. Mark Hastings, right? I'm Alexander Collins. I heard you know Sophie very well. Mark looked at Alexander curious. What do you want with her? It's not about what I want, but what we can do together. Sophie has destroyed many lives, including my friend Richard Montgomery's. I'm here to ensure she pays for it. Mark let out a bitter laugh. Sophie is a snake. I used to trust her, but she stabbed me in the back. What do you need? Alexander explained the plan, and Mark, motivated by bitterness and the promise of justice, agreed to help. He had access to inside information about Sophie, details that could be used to sabotage her alliances and dismantle her support network. With Sarah and Mark on board, Richard felt his plan was stronger than ever. Each new ally brought information and resources that could be used to tighten the noose around Sophie and Michael. The following days were filled with secret meetings and careful planning. Sarah provided incriminating documents about Michael, while Mark revealed details about Sophie's weaknesses and secrets. With this new information, Richard, as Alexander, began orchestrating a series of calculated moves. One night, during a party at a luxurious mansion, Alexander met Sophie again. He approached her with a charming smile. Sophie, you look stunning as always. She smiled, but there was a shadow of worry in her eyes. Alexander, it's always a pleasure to see you. How are things? Interesting, Alexander replied, taking a sip of his champagne. You know, there are rumors circulating about Michael. I heard he's in trouble with the law. Sophie sighed, her expression tense. Yes, the recent times have been difficult, but he's dealing with it. I hope so, Alexander said, maintaining a tone of genuine concern. If you need anything, know that I'm here to help. As the night progressed, Alexander stayed close, observing and listening. Every conversation, every interaction was an opportunity to manipulate and influence, planting more seeds of doubt and distrust. Behind the scenes, Sarah and Mark were working hard, using their connections and information to dismantle Sophie and Michael's support network. Each day, their position became more precarious, and Richard knew the decisive moment was approaching. With his unexpected allies by his side, Richard, as Alexander, was ready to continue his relentless pursuit of justice. Sophie and Michael had no idea what was coming, but Richard was determined to ensure they paid for their betrayals. The night was just beginning, and the game of revenge continued to unfold, growing more intense and relentless. The night was quiet in the cabin, except for the soft sound of leaves rustling in the wind. Richard, Jack, Sam, Sarah, and Mark gathered around the table, the flickering lamplight casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Information flowed as they analyzed every detail of the recent discoveries about Sophie and Michael. "We have to expose their vulnerabilities in a precise and devastating manner," Richard said, his determined gaze fixed on the documents before him. Sarah, with her vast experience in Michael's shady businesses, took the floor. Michael always had a weak point: his unbridled ambition. He's so obsessed with power and money that he often makes mistakes, especially when he feels cornered. Mark nodded, adding, "Sophie, on the other hand, has a fragile ego. She needs to be admired, to be the center of attention. Anything that threatens her public image can deeply destabilize her." Richard knew these vulnerabilities were the key to bringing them down. "Let's focus on Michael first. We need to use his own ambition against him." With Sarah's help, Richard devised a plan to lure Michael into a fake investment. They created a phantom company, promising extraordinary returns, something Michael couldn't resist. Alexander, Richard's alter ego, would be the intermediary, ensuring everything seemed legitimate. A week later, Alexander met Michael at an upscale restaurant, presenting the proposal. "Michael, I have an opportunity you can't miss. This investment can double your capital in a few months." Michael's eyes gleamed with greed. "Tell me more, Alexander." Alexander presented the fake documents, impressive growth charts, and a forged history of successes. "It's a risky business, but the rewards are enormous. We need a quick decision, though." Unable to resist the promise of easy profit, Michael took the bait. "I'm in. Let's do this." With Michael committed, the trap was set. In the following days, Alexander and Sarah worked to increase the pressure, making it seem like the investment was about to collapse. Panicked, Michael began making impulsive decisions, diverting funds from other operations to try and save his investment. Meanwhile, Mark and Jack focused on Sophie. Mark knew the best way to hit Sophie was through her reputation. They began spreading rumors in social circles, insinuating that Sophie was involved in illicit activities and that her fortune was built on lies and betrayals. During an elegant cocktail party, Alexander met Sophie again. He approached with a worried smile. "Sophie, I've heard some disturbing rumors about you recently. I wanted to make sure you were aware." Sophie frowned, clearly alarmed. "What kind of rumors, Alexander?" "They say you're under investigation for fraud and that your fortune is at risk." "I didn't believe it, but I thought I should warn you." Sophie tried to maintain her composure, but it was evident she was shaken. "That's absurd. Someone is trying to sabotage me." "I hope so," Alexander said with a supportive tone. "If you need help, I'm here." With each move, Richard and his team destabilized Sophie and Michael in ways they couldn't foresee. Michael's ambition was leading him to ruin, while Sophie's public image was slowly being eroded. One night, while reviewing the progress, Sarah brought a new revelation. "I found that Michael has a secret account where he keeps illegal funds. If we expose this account, it will be the final blow." Richard smiled, seeing the final piece of the puzzle fall into place. "Let's do it. We need to ensure all their vulnerabilities are exposed at once." With Sam's help, who was a master at digital infiltration, they accessed Michael's secret account and transferred the information to the authorities. At the same time, Mark intensified the rumors about Sophie, ensuring the media picked them up and amplified them. The bomb exploded the next morning. News of Michael's secret account and the fraud allegations against Sophie dominated the headlines. Investigations were launched, and both found themselves surrounded by scandals and suspicions. Sophie and Michael were finally at the breaking point. Richard watched from afar, seeing his enemies crumble under the weight of their own flaws. The vulnerabilities they had exploited were now in full view, and the fall was inevitable. In the silence of the cabin, Richard's team celebrated quietly. They knew the battle was far from over, but each step brought them closer to justice. Richard was determined to see this through to the end, and with his allies by his side, he knew nothing could stop him. The storm Richard, as Alexander, had unleashed was intensifying. Sophie and Michael were struggling to keep their lives together as the world around them crumbled. But Richard knew there was one crucial card he hadn't yet played. He needed to expose Michael not only as a criminal accomplice but also as a traitor in the most personal sense. Sarah brought new information that was the perfect catalyst for the next move. I found out that Michael isn't just Sophie's partner. He's also romantically involved with another woman, something Sophie is completely unaware of. Richard smiled. This is perfect. We'll use this information to unmask Michael once and for all. The team quickly devised a plan to publicly and humiliatingly expose Michael's affair. Jack and Sam set up a scheme to capture photographic and video evidence of Michael with his mistress. Sarah, with her corporate connections, ensured these evidences would reach the right hands at the right time. That night, Michael was seen entering an upscale restaurant with his mistress, a young, elegant woman clearly not Sophie. Jack, disguised as a waiter, discreetly placed cameras around their table, capturing every intimate moment. Sam, outside, monitored the exits and entrances, ensuring Michael couldn't escape. Meanwhile, Alexander made sure Sophie was in the right place to see everything. He invited her to dinner at the same restaurant, claiming he wanted to discuss an important business opportunity. Sophie, eager for anything that could help improve her situation, accepted the invitation. Sophie arrived at the restaurant, stunning in an elegant black dress. Alexander met her at the entrance, offering his arm with a smile. "Sophie, it's a pleasure to see you. Let's go inside. I'm sure you'll like what I have to discuss." He led her to a table strategically positioned with a clear view of Michael's table with his mistress. Alexander kept the conversation light and pleasant, waiting for the perfect moment. Sophie was beginning to feel at ease when her eyes fell on Michael across the restaurant. She widened her eyes, surprised and confused. "Alexander, is that Michael?" Alexander feigned surprise. "Michael? It can't be." But as Sophie watched, it became clear it was indeed Michael, laughing and intimately conversing with the young woman. The color drained from Sophie's face as she saw her husband touch the mistress's hand, the betrayal visible for all to see. He's cheating on me," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling with shock and anger. Alexander placed a hand on her shoulder, pretending empathy. "Sophie, I'm sorry you have to see this. Maybe we should leave." But Sophie was frozen, unable to look away. Her anger grew, transforming into uncontrollable fury. She abruptly stood up, knocking over the chair and attracting everyone's attention. "Michael!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the restaurant. "How could you do this to me?" Michael, caught by surprise, looked up and saw Sophie approaching, her face a mask of rage and pain. He tried to stand, but the cameras were all focused on him now, recording every second of the confrontation. "Sophie, I can explain," he began, but she interrupted him, her voice sharp. "Explain? You're cheating on me, Michael. And in public. Everything we've built, everything we've faced, and you stab me in the back like this." The surrounding patrons murmured, some even recording the scene with their phones. The scandal was unfolding live, and there was no turning back. Alexander watched, satisfied with the turn of events. He knew this public exposure would be a devastating blow for Michael, not only personally but also professionally. Sophie, humiliated and betrayed, would be even easier to manipulate from now on. As the scene continued, Alexander gently pulled Sophie away, pretending to be the savior amidst the chaos. "Let's get out of here, Sophie. You don't need to go through this in front of everyone." She allowed him to guide her out of the restaurant, her tears of anger still glistening under the streetlights. "Alexander, I don't know what to do. Everything is falling apart." "I'm here for you," Alexander said softly. "Together we'll get through this." With Michael exposed and Sophie vulnerable, Richard knew he was closer than ever to his final revenge. He had unmasked the lover, destroyed Sophie's trust, and isolated his enemies from their support networks. Now it was just a matter of time before they completely fell, crushed by the weight of their own betrayals. The public scandal involving Michael and his mistress deeply shook Sophie, but Richard knew there was still more work to be done. With Michael and Sophie emotionally devastated, the next step was to completely dismantle their fortunes. Financial destruction was key to ensuring they had no resources to recover or seek revenge. Richard gathered his team at the cabin to discuss the next move. Jack brought detailed financial reports, while Sam and Sarah prepared the necessary legal actions. "We need to ensure their finances are completely compromised," Richard said, his voice firm. "This will require a multifaceted approach." Jack began explaining the situation. "Michael has a complex network of accounts and investments. Some are legitimate, but many are tied to his illegal activities. If we can expose these connections, we can trigger a series of investigations and account freezes." Sarah added, "Sophie is also in a vulnerable position. Her businesses are supported by investors who are already nervous about the rumors and the public scandal. We need to push them to abandon ship." Richard agreed. "We'll attack on multiple fronts. Jack, you and Sam handle Michael's financial fraud. Sarah and I will destabilize Sophie's businesses." The first step of the plan involved sending anonymous information to the financial authorities about Michael's illegal activities. Sam, using his infiltration skills, compiled a detailed dossier with all the evidence they had gathered. This dossier was sent to regulatory agencies and justice departments, ensuring an investigation would be initiated. At the same time, Jack used his connections to spread the news among Michael's investors. "You need to protect your investments," he said in discreet meetings. "Michael is involved in illegal activities, and when this comes to light, your assets will be at risk." The investors, already nervous about the scandal, began to withdraw their funds, forcing Michael to sell assets to cover the withdrawals. The financial pressure increased daily, and Michael, desperate, made increasingly erratic decisions. Meanwhile, Richard and Sarah focused on Sophie. They knew she depended on her investors' confidence to keep her businesses afloat. Sarah used her influence in the sector to plant doubts among Sophie's key investors. During an investors' meeting, Alexander presented himself with a concerned expression. "Gentlemen, there's something you need to know about Sophie," he began, displaying documents Sarah had obtained. "She's involved in a series of suspicious financial activities. If these become public, it could be disastrous for your investments." The investors, already shaken by the rumors and the public scandal, began to question the viability of continuing to support Sophie. She tried desperately to calm their fears, but the trust was irreparably damaged. In the following days, Sophie faced a series of crises. Investors withdrew their support, business partners canceled contracts, and her company's stocks plummeted. Every attempt to stabilize her situation was thwarted by new problems and more defections. Michael, for his part, was struggling to stay afloat. The financial authorities' investigations led to the freezing of several of his accounts, and the press was all over him, amplifying every detail of the scandal. Without resources to defend himself, he watched his financial empire crumble. In a critical moment, Michael tried to meet with Sophie to seek an alliance, but she coldly rejected him. "You ruined everything," she said with a look of contempt. "I have nothing to do with you anymore." With their fortunes in ruins and without allies, Sophie and Michael were completely helpless. Richard watched from a distance, satisfied with the progress. He knew there was still more to be done, but financial destruction was a crucial blow. They no longer had the resources to fight back, making them vulnerable to the final strike. At the cabin, the team celebrated their success quietly. "We're closer than ever," Richard said, raising a glass in a toast. "Thank you all for your hard work. We couldn't have come this far without each one of you." The financial destruction of Sophie and Michael was a devastating blow, but Richard knew there was still more to be done. To ensure there was no escape for them, he needed detailed information about their next moves. This required high-level espionage and infiltration. Jack and Sam began preparing the next step. "We need to place bugs and cameras in the right places," Jack said, studying the plans of Sophie and Michael's homes and offices. "This will give us access to all their conversations and plans." Sam, always efficient, was ready for the task. "We'll do it at night when security is more relaxed. We need to be quick and precise." That night, the team split up. Jack and Sam went to Sophie's house, while Richard and Sarah headed to Michael's office. Equipped with listening devices and hidden cameras, they were prepared to infiltrate without being detected. Sophie's house was a luxurious fortress, surrounded by high walls and security systems. Jack and Sam silently scaled the wall, avoiding the security cameras with skill. Once inside, they moved through the shadows, installing microphones in key rooms and cameras in strategic points. Meanwhile, Richard and Sarah entered Michael's office building. Using security codes they had obtained with Mark's help, they passed the reception and headed to Michael's floor. They worked quickly, placing listening devices in his office and cameras in the meeting rooms. With the devices installed, the team discreetly retreated, leaving everything in place. In the following days, they began monitoring Sophie and Michael's conversations, gathering crucial information about their plans and movements. One afternoon, while reviewing the recordings, Richard and Jack heard something that caught their attention. Sophie was speaking with a lawyer, discussing an escape plan. "Michael and I need to leave the country," she said, her voice filled with desperation. "We have offshore accounts that can support us. We need to act quickly." Jack frowned. "They're planning to flee. We need to act before they have the chance." Richard nodded, determination shining in his eyes. "We'll ensure they don't get away." As they continued to monitor, they discovered that Michael was trying to quickly sell what remained of his assets. He had a meeting scheduled with a buyer interested in his properties, a last desperate attempt to get money before fleeing. Richard decided to intervene directly. Using his identity as Alexander Collins, he presented himself as an interested buyer. "Michael, I heard you're selling some properties. I'm willing to make a generous offer." Desperate for money, Michael accepted the meeting. During the meeting, Alexander presented a proposal that seemed advantageous, but was actually filled with clauses that would complicate the sale. In his rush, Michael signed the contract without realizing the trap. With the deal done, Richard had control over Michael's remaining assets, leaving him even more cornered. Meanwhile, Jack and Sam accessed Sophie's offshore accounts, providing this information to the authorities to ensure her funds were frozen. Unaware that her plans were being monitored, Sophie continued making arrangements for the escape. One night, Richard and his team heard a conversation indicating the exact moment Sophie and Michael planned to leave. They were going to try to take a private flight in secret, escaping before the authorities could act. "We have to intercept them at the airport," Richard said urgently. "We can't let them flee." The team prepared for the interception. Sarah used her connections to ensure authorities were present at the airport, ready to act. Jack and Sam positioned themselves strategically to ensure Sophie and Michael had no way to escape. On the night of the escape, Sophie and Michael arrived at the airport in a discreet car, trying to avoid attention. But as they approached the hangar where the private jet awaited, they were met by a team of police and federal agents. "Sophie Thompson, Michael Smith, you are under arrest for fraud, money laundering, and attempted escape," said the lead agent as they were both handcuffed. Sophie and Michael were stunned, realizing their plans had been completely thwarted. As they were taken away, their eyes met Richard's, who watched from a distance with a satisfied smile. The espionage and infiltration mission had been a complete success. With Sophie and Michael now in the hands of justice, Richard felt a huge weight lifted from his shoulders. He had managed to completely dismantle their lives, and revenge was nearly complete. Back at the cabin, the team celebrated their success. "We're almost there," Richard said, raising a glass in a toast. "Thank you all for your hard work. We couldn't have come this far without each one of you." With Sophie and Michael arrested and their financial lives in ruins, Richard knew it was time to publicly expose all the hidden truths. He needed to ensure their betrayals and crimes were known to all, destroying any remaining credibility and respect they might have. The morning after the arrest, Richard called a press conference. The media was eager for new information, and journalists from all major networks attended, their cameras and microphones ready to capture every detail. Richard, still using his identity as Alexander Collins, stepped onto the makeshift stage, his gaze firm and determined. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press, thank you for being here today," he began, his voice steady. What I am about to reveal is a story of betrayal, corruption, and justice." The journalists murmured among themselves, eager for what was to come. Richard paused, letting the suspense build before continuing. "Sophie Thompson and Michael Smith have been arrested for fraud, money laundering, and attempted escape. But these are just their most recent crimes. They built their fortunes on lies, manipulation, and betrayal." Richard presented a series of documents that Sarah and Jack had meticulously prepared. Here are detailed proofs of Michael Smith's criminal activities, including records of money laundering, financial fraud, and his connections to organized crime. He held up another set of documents. "And here are the evidences against Sophie Thompson, showing her involvement in fraudulent schemes, manipulation of investors, and her desperate attempt to flee from justice." The camera flashes illuminated the room as journalists took pictures of the displayed documents. Richard knew each photo, each headline would amplify Sophie and Michael's downfall. "But that's not all," Richard continued. "They also betrayed the trust of friends, partners, and even each other. Michael kept a secret affair, deceiving Sophie while engaging in criminal activities. And Sophie, obsessed with power and control, manipulated everyone around her, including those who trusted her." The murmurs in the room grew louder as journalists absorbed the revelations. Richard knew this information would cause a shockwave, destroying any remaining support for Sophie and Michael. "But justice is being served," Richard said, his voice firm. "They will face the consequences of their actions. And I hope this story serves as a warning to all who think they can manipulate and deceive others with impunity." As he finished his speech, Richard stepped down from the stage, applauded by some and surrounded by questions from journalists. He knew he had achieved the goal of completely exposing Sophie and Michael, ensuring their fall was public and irreversible. That night, the news spread like wildfire. Headlines and TV news were filled with explosive revelations. Sophie and Michael became pariahs in the business world, their names synonymous with corruption and betrayal. As he watched the reports, Richard felt a sense of justice finally being achieved. He had exposed the truth, dismantled Sophie and Michael's lives, and ensured they faced the consequences of their actions. But he knew there was still one final act to be concluded. The final confrontation was approaching, and Richard was prepared to end this story of betrayal and revenge once and for all. In the following days, Sophie and Michael were the targets of intense investigation, with new details emerging about their criminal activities. Richard, now free to reveal his true identity, was ready for the final confrontation, knowing justice was within his reach. The scandal involving Sophie and Michael exploded in the media, deeply shaking their lives and support networks. However, Richard knew that despite the explosive revelations, there was still more to be done to ensure Sophie's ultimate downfall. He needed a final blow, something that would leave her with no chance of recovery. As Sophie faced a whirlwind of accusations and investigations, Richard planned the next move with his team. "We need to dig up all of Sophie's darkest secrets," he said, his voice full of determination. "Something that will completely destroy any remaining support she has." Sarah, always astute, brought new information. "We found out that Sophie was involved in a series of real estate frauds. She manipulated documents and deceived families to take their properties." Jack added, "And there's more. Sophie is linked to a bribery network involving local politicians. She used these connections to protect her businesses and hide her illegal activities." Richard knew these new revelations would be devastating. They needed to expose everything in a way that left no doubt about Sophie's true nature. They decided to hold a press conference, this time conducted by Richard himself, revealing his true identity to the world. On the morning of the conference, the hall was filled with journalists and onlookers. Richard, now as himself, stepped onto the stage, the anticipation growing in the air. He looked at the crowd, took a deep breath, and began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Richard Montgomery. I am here to reveal the truth about Sophie Thompson, a woman who betrayed my trust and the trust of many others." The journalists began murmuring, surprised by the revelation of Richard's identity. He held up a series of documents for everyone to see. Sophie is not only guilty of fraud and financial manipulation, she is also involved in a real estate fraud scheme that harmed countless families. Here are proofs that she falsified documents to take possession of properties and deceive innocent people. The camera flashes illuminated the hall as Richard continued. Moreover, Sophie is deeply connected to a bribery network involving local politicians. She used these connections to protect her dirty businesses and avoid investigations. The journalist's indignation was evident. Richard knew these revelations would be Sophie's final downfall, but he still had more to say. And finally, I want to reveal something personal. Sophie and Michael not only betrayed their investors and business partners, but they also betrayed me. They tried to kill me to take my fortune, but I am here alive to ensure justice is served. The room fell into absolute silence as everyone absorbed the revelations. Richard, with a determined look, concluded, "Sophie Thompson must face the consequences of her actions, and I guarantee she will not escape justice." After the conference, the news spread quickly. Sophie's image was completely destroyed. Politicians who had once supported her began to distance themselves, fearing being dragged into the scandal. Investors withdrew their remaining funds, and her businesses began to collapse. Meanwhile, Sophie, isolated and desperate, tried in vain to save what was left of her life. She knew she was cornered, without allies and without resources to defend herself. Each new day brought more bad news, and her reputation was irreparably ruined. One afternoon, Richard received a call from Sarah. "Sophie is trying to meet with Michael in prison. It seems she's desperate for any help." Richard smiled, knowing Sophie's fall was complete. He decided to watch the meeting, knowing it would seal her fate once and for all. On the day of the meeting, Richard watched from a surveillance room as Sophie entered the prison visiting room. She was pale and worn out, a shadow of the powerful woman she once was. Michael, equally destroyed, was on the other side of the table. "Michael, we need to find a way out of this," Sophie said, her voice trembling. Michael laughed bitterly. "A way out? Don't you see? We're finished, Sophie. It's all over because of you." Sophie tried to protest, but the reality was inescapable. Her actions had destroyed not only their lives but also any possibility of redemption. As she walked away, Richard felt a sense of justice finally achieved. Sophie Thompson had fallen, and her fall was absolute. With her life in ruins and no hope of recovery, she had become an example of what happens when ambition and betrayal go too far. Sophie's fall had been devastating, but Richard knew there was one final act to be performed: the grand confrontation with Michael. This moment would be the culmination of his entire journey of revenge, the climax where justice would be served beyond question. Richard spent the following days mentally preparing for the confrontation. He knew facing Michael directly would require strength and determination, but also an impeccable strategy. He decided the best way to deal with Michael was to confront him in an environment where he couldn't escape: prison. Using his connections, Richard arranged a meeting with Michael in prison. He wanted to look his enemy in the eye, to see the man who had tried to kill him brought down to nothing. The day of the meeting arrived, and Richard entered the prison with a sense of finality. Michael was brought to the visiting room, looking worn out and defeated. He saw Richard and a flicker of recognition and anger crossed his face. "Richard Montgomery," he spat, sitting down heavily. "I should have known you'd survive." Richard sat opposite Michael, his gaze steady. "You underestimated me, Michael, and now you're going to pay for everything you've done." Michael laughed bitterly. "Pay? Look at me, Richard. I've lost everything. Sophie's gone, my business is destroyed, and I'm stuck in here." Richard leaned forward, his voice cold. "You deserve every bit of it. You betrayed me, tried to kill me, and for what? Greed? Power?" Michael's eyes flared with defiance. "You were always so righteous, Richard. But you're no better than me. You're just more cunning." Richard shook his head. "The difference is I fight for justice. You fight for selfish gain. And now justice has caught up with you." For a moment, silence filled the room, the weight of their shared history hanging heavy between them. Richard could see the fear and realization in Michael's eyes. He was truly defeated. "You'll rot in here, Michael," Richard said, standing up. "And I'll make sure you have nothing left to hope for." As he turned to leave, Michael's voice called out, desperate, "Richard, wait. We can make a deal. I still have contacts, money hidden away. We can." Richard cut him off, not even looking back. "Your time for deals is over, Michael. This is the end." Walking out of the prison, Richard felt a profound sense of closure. The grand confrontation had ended with the finality he needed. Michael was defeated, left to face the consequences of his actions alone. Back at the cabin, Richard met with his team one last time. They celebrated their victory quietly, knowing the mission was finally complete. "We did it," Richard said, raising his glass. "We achieved justice. Thank you all for your unwavering support." Jack, Sarah, Sam and Mark raised their glasses in return, the bond forged through their shared struggle evident. "To justice," they echoed, clinking their glasses together. With the final act of his revenge complete, Richard felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. The journey had been arduous, filled with danger and deception, but in the end he had triumphed. He had dismantled the lives of those who betrayed him, ensuring they could never harm anyone again. As the night grew quiet, Richard stood outside the cabin, looking up at the star-filled sky. He knew his life would never be the same, but he also knew he had the strength and resolve to face whatever the future held. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city. Richard felt a long-forgotten tranquility as he walked through the streets. The journey of vengeance had finally come to an end, and now it was time to find a new purpose, a new life beyond the pain and betrayal that had consumed him for so long. With Sophie and Michael out of the picture, Richard decided that the best way to start this new phase was to revisit the places that had been important to him before everything fell apart. He needed to remember who he was before the betrayal and reclaim the part of himself that had been lost in the pursuit of justice. That morning, he drove to the old house where he grew up, a place that always brought memories of simpler and happier times. The house was still there, untouched by time, with a well-kept garden and blooming flowers. Richard smiled as he saw the old tree where he used to play as a child. He sat under the tree's shade, feeling a deep peace that seemed to heal the wounds of the past. While he was there, he received a call from Jack. "Richard, there's a charity event tonight. I think it would be good for you to go. A chance to meet new people and who knows, maybe start anew." Richard hesitated for a moment but knew Jack was right. It was time to move on. He accepted the invitation and went to the event. The hall was filled with friendly faces, people who had gathered to support a noble cause. Richard felt a slight anxiety, but also an excitement for starting something new. As he conversed with various guests, he noticed a woman across the hall. She had a warm smile and eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface. Determined to seize the opportunity, Richard approached her. "Hello, I'm Richard Montgomery. It's a pleasure to meet you." She smiled, extending her hand. "Nice to meet you, Richard. I'm Emily. What brings you here today?" Richard felt an instant connection. "I needed a new beginning." This event seemed like the perfect place for that. As the evening progressed, Richard and Emily talked about their lives, dreams, and challenges. He felt comfortable, as if he was finally opening up to the possibility of happiness again. In the following days, Richard and Emily continued to meet, building a friendship that soon turned into something deeper. She was kind, understanding, and brought a lightness to Richard's life that he hadn't felt in a long time. Meanwhile, Richard also began to engage in charitable activities, using his experience and resources to help the less fortunate. He found purpose in giving back to the community, in being a positive force in the world. One day, while walking with Emily in the park, Richard stopped and looked at the horizon. "You know, Emily, for a long time my life was consumed by revenge, but now I feel like I've finally found peace. And that's thanks to you." Emily smiled, squeezing his hand. "I'm happy to be part of this new phase of your life, Richard. Everyone deserves a second chance, a new beginning." Richard knew she was right. Revenge had brought justice, But it was love and compassion that would bring true redemption. He had transformed the pain of the past into a future full of hope and purpose. That night, as he gazed at the stars beside Emily, Richard felt a sense of completeness. He had faced his demons, found justice, and now was ready to embrace life with a renewed heart. The journey of Richard Montgomery, marked by betrayals and revenge, finally found its end in a new beginning. He was ready to live fully, with the certainty that justice had been served and that love and redemption were possible. As the night enveloped the city, Richard knew he was where he needed to be, at peace with himself and ready for whatever the future brought. He had found not only justice but also a new reason to live, a purpose that would light up his days and warm his nights.